After the launch of the Nintendo 64, like many consoles, there's a period where the release schedule is a little thin on the ground, as most developers had done all they could to get their new games ready for the big launch. This lull period before the console's second wave of releases was often a difficult time for the gaming media, as trying to keep the momentum going for the system proved challenging. This led to many games being positioned as going head to head with one another, to try and create a false sense of excitement and to keep interest going. One of the earliest head-to-head battles on Nintendo 64 was that of M.R.C versus Top Gear Rally, the console's first two rally-like racing games, and seeing as they were releasing around the same time, it was ultimately positioned as a battle to become the N64's first standout racing game. If you've been here long enough, you'll know where I stood on this one. Top Gear Rally really just wasn't for me, and I much prefer the more arcade-like M.R.C. But the reality is that both games are so different that I really don't think they were ever up against each other directly. Genki started development of the game in 1996 and it was first shown off at the Tokyo Game Show of '97. Whilst there were some big third-party developers who publicly supported Nintendo with their big franchise announcements, Imagineer was perhaps the smallest of the early companies to go out on a limb and say that they were all in for N64. Despite having one of the smaller booths at Game World in '97, if visitors to the booths were anything to go by, then you could have been fooled into thinking that Imagineer were one of the big boys, as they had one of the most played games, which was M.R.C, Multi-Racing Championship as it's better known as. This support for Imagineer from the public was perhaps expected, as the studio really did have an emphasis on the Japanese market with their baseball game releases and also announcements of future projects like SimCity 2000 and of course Quest 64. After Nintendo embarrassingly lost to Square Enix's support for Nintendo 64, then Imagineer were being groomed to fill the void with the genres which Japanese gamers wanted. M.R.C, however, was to be the studio's first published game on N64 outside of Japan, and with them having already announced Western releases for some of their other in-development projects, they really needed to hit the ground running to show off what they could do. So we arrive in late summer of 1997, and over the next 3 months the game would start being released across the world. The game was published by Imagineer in July, whilst Ocean picked up the international release in North America and Europe. Upon its release, the game was met with mostly average reviews, with a common criticism being the limited number of tracks, which severely impacts the longevity of the game, with the most common praise being for the game's handling, and what they described as its realistic approach to racing. If you want to laugh, then why not dig out the review by Next Generation, who went as far to say that they've been told by some Sega loyalists that they would buy an N64 console just to be able to play this game. In case anyone watching doesn't own an N64, please don't buy a console just to play this game. So in terms of the game visuals, I think that for the time they're actually solid enough. What I liked most here is that whilst many other early N64 racing games would have more tracks, they would often be repeating some of the textures which made them all look a little bit too similar. Here at least, the studio made every track look visually unique. However, given there's only 3 tracks, I can imagine that wasn't particularly difficult for them to do. If you put this game side by side with Top Gear Rally, and hey, if the magazines were all doing it back then, then why can't I? Visually it looks more arcade-like, but in terms of visual clarity and resolution, then it looks decidedly out of date already by the point it was released. There is a spattering of fog in the game which masks some of the pop-up, but it's not as thick as even some later N64 racing games would get. This is actually helped by the clever track design, which uses a lot of tight turns and shorter racing sections, which helps take pressure off the game's engine. You'll notice though that as soon as you get into any areas of the track which are lighter and more open, or have longer sections, that you'll either get a dose of fog or pop-up, or in some cases both of them. Look, it's not a game breaker for me, and the fact that the sense of speed in the game remains higher than say Top Gear Rally is a big plus for me. It's never going to beat F-Zero X for a sense of speed, but when it comes to getting a sense of pace, then this one would be the clear winner over TGR. The key differentiator with this racing game though are the multiple routes through the game's limited courses. Throughout the races you're open to choosing different routes, and each route will be more suited to a different style of racing and also be more suited to different vehicle setups. This adds some artificial longevity to the game because you'll likely be wanting to experiment with not only your choice of vehicle, but also the setup, the route, and which combination of routes you'll use to get the best results for the overall lap times. For a game which is lacking in the number of tracks, it does what it could do to try and squeeze every bit of life out of what was available to them. This is expanded on further by the weather conditions, which do genuinely make your handling change, and so it's not just a cosmetic window dressing for aesthetic purposes. There's also some small things you'll notice whilst racing, such as your lights turning on when you enter tunnels, spectators by the roadside, or even animals crossing the track. Whilst it's not game changing, I've always appreciated these little details that help make the courses feel more alive. In terms of the game's handling though, this one's night and day different when compared to Top Gear Rally. If you're after a more simulation-like experience, then TGR is the one to play. Its unique 4-point floating suspension system was groundbreaking on release, and whilst I never personally enjoyed it, because it felt overly floaty, I know in terms of realism it's much stronger than what we have here. Funnily enough however, M.R.C's handling is one of the most applauded features from reviewers back in the day, and whilst I'll admit it takes some getting used to, I much prefer the more arcade-like sensitivity that this game offers. Perhaps the weakest area of the game comes in its sound department, and whilst the music's not terrible, it's just very slim pickings, which combined with 3 tracks means that there's not really much here to help craft an identity. It sounds like some strange early 90s dance music from a Berlin nightclub at 4 AM. The sound effects too are quite low quality, and the engine noises seem a bit all over the place, and don't have enough bass to sound like powerful rally cars. Also, the pitch changes far too often when you're racing, so even if you go over a small bump, it will alter dramatically, which can become really annoying. I did however like the commentator / co-pilot who's barking out directions, which come at just the right time, and they're delivered clearly enough to be useful to you when playing. Another big positive for me in the game was the aggression levels of your AI opponents, which I think have the perfect balancing when racing. Each race puts you up against 9 other drivers, and no surprises they become increasingly more difficult to overtake as you work your way up the table. By the time you get to the top 3 drivers, they have no hesitation in trying to run you off the road, but equally they give you just enough opportunities to take them so that you can go past them. Wrapping things up, the game offers support for 2 players, so head-to-head racing adds some depth, but a 4-player mode would have greatly helped the game's appeal and reach. It does have quite a unique mode which sees you go up against secret cars which are dubbed as God and Devil cars. They have superior stats and you must beat them in head-to-head races to unlock them. This was a nice challenge for anyone who's blasted through the Grand Prix and really wanted to test their skills and unlock these special motors. Overall, it's a great early N64 racing game in my opinion. Decades later now, it looks like a very early racer when compared to the other phenomenal racing games on the system like, say, Beetle Adventure Racing or World Driver Championship. But there was a time when the schoolyard was all about M.R.C versus TGR. And in the end, it's gamers that won because they got 2 very different racing games that meant arcade and sim fans could both rejoice. And so for today's topic of conversation, let's have it out once and for all and comment below who you think won the war between these 2 titles. For me, it was M.R.C, despite the reviewers of the era generally favouring Top Gear Rally at a much greater level. But at the end of the day, it's about what style you like and what game you want to play. So as always, thank you for watching, and until next time.